Hello everybody and welcome to our session today on sporting heritage and neurodiversity, where we'll be introducing what neurodiversity is, what neurodivergence is, and the terminology and impetus for us thinking about how our organisations and cultural institutions fit for neurodiversity and neurodivergent audiences. So I am Dr. Justine Reilly. I'm the Director of Sporting Heritage and I also run the Neurodiverse Museum. Soraya Hall is our Programme Assistant for the Neurodiverse Museum, and later on we'll be able to give you information and details about how to contact us and find out more about the website, the Neurodiverse Museum and the Neurodiverse Museums Network. So today we've got quite a packed programme. We'll be looking at what is neurodiversity, some of the terminology to understand what neurodiversity and neurodivergent terminology is, how we should speak about neurodivergent audiences, how we should consult them, and then looking at a pilot programme that we've been developing called the Neurodiverse Museum. We'll also be looking at where does neurodiversity fit within cultural institutions and how this affects you and your workforce and your role within your organisation. And then we'll be thinking about where does training fit within your activity and what kind of needs do you have going forward. And throughout there'll be opportunities for questions and answers, and hopefully that should be a really good programme to support you in your organisation. So the first thing we want to look at is asking you to work together in breakout rooms to consider what is neurodiversity. Everyone will have come up this session for different reasons and will be here for different reasons. Some people might have a really good idea about what it is. Some people will have never heard of the term before. So it's really useful for us to understand, where is everybody coming at? What do you think neurodiversity is at this stage? And then we can frame the rest of the session around where the understanding is the groups. So I'm going to ask Fran to put you into small breakout groups. If when you're in those groups, you could assign somebody to come back and feed back to us what you discussed. There's just 5 minutes, so there's not a lot of time. But I think it'll be good. We usually tend to get quite a lot of information that comes back from this. So the key question is, what is neurodiversity? Assign somebody as the person who's going to feed back to the group. And Fran, I don't know if you're ready to send people off.
Yes, I've set up the breakout rooms. So there'll be 5 or 6 of you in each room. If you've not used breakout rooms before, as soon as I open the rooms, you'll get an invite on your screen. If you click on the invite, it will whisk you away into your breakout room with your other colleagues. And yeah, if you can talk through what Justine's just talked about, and then we'll bring you back together in about 5 minutes or so. You'll know when the breakout room is going to close because you'll get a little warning, and then it will automatically bring you back into the main space. So just opening up the rooms now, so you should get your invites.
Is everyone back, Fran?
Yes, everybody's back.
Brilliant. Okay, so how was that? Okay. Good stuff. So there were 2 rooms, and I'm going to take some notes on Jamboard just to keep a record of what you were talking about, for our reference and for yours as well. So if there's spelling mistakes, which there will be, please ignore them, and we will share this as well. So if I could ask someone from the first group, it doesn't matter which group, whether you know which room you're in or not, but someone to say, yep, go on, I was nominated, and to start. I can't see you all, so I can't see anybody nodding, so feel free to unmute and start talking. Oh, Janice, I can see you.
Hi, I'll jump in. We a couple different people had ideas about what neurodiversity might mean, and we talked about that it might cover people with different mental capacities, that it might be also about different ways of behaving that might affect how a person interacts with other people. And we also talked about just thinking broadly in terms of difference, that we all have different abilities. So it's just about kind of developing a wider understanding of difference through thinking about issues around neurodiversity.
Thank you. Anybody from that group have anything else to add? Okay, the other group.
I think that would be me. I'm sorry, I arrived a bit late. But I think I was nominated because I'm the mother of a neurodiverse child. So I think I have experience both as a kind of gallery and museum visitor, as well as a museum practitioner. I guess we discussed how the label of neurodiversity is somehow not conforming with expectations of kind of what is considered normal behavior in a social setting. And it's quite broad, and even within subcategories or labels like ADHD or autistic spectrum disorder, there may be a variety of behaviors and subconditions. And I guess in the particular example, again with ADHD, things that I've experienced with my son may be that the person coming into the museum or the gallery may experience anxiety in particular crowded situations, may not conform to the idea that when you come into a museum you need to be silent and stay away from the exhibits and not touch. And so there are certain museums that are perhaps already more in tune with that and with different ways of experiencing, and provide facilities such as breakout rooms or calm spaces, or specific times, for example, for accessing the facilities.
Hoping that I've managed to keep up with all of those notes while you're going through. No, it was brilliant. No, great to catch all of that. Anyone else in that group have anything else to add? Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share and go back into presentation. So bear with me. That's the wrong button there. If I could ask everybody to be on mute while they're not talking, that would be amazing. Thank you. I am also neurodivergent, and so the things in the background can throw me off quite quickly. So that's amazing, because that gives me a real understanding about where everybody's thinking at the moment in terms of neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and the different kind of ways that might affect what your current activity is and where you might need support going forward. So it's brilliant. It gives a really good kind of baseline of understanding. So the next section of the training webinar is to look at what is neurodiversity, how does that differ from the term neurodivergent, then looking and thinking about clinical deficit language, the terminology that's used, thinking about the identity first language and how various different ways of neurodivergent terminology can be used, and then looking at community-led and removing barriers for neurodivergent people. So some of this might start to get quite in-depth. Again, drop any questions in the chat, and we'll have a section in a moment where we'll go through all of those. So if anything isn't clear, doesn't make sense, or you need it going through again, or you don't agree with it, please put it in the chat and we can talk that through in the next one. So what is neurodiversity and what is neurodivergent? So I think you covered some of the things that we would discuss and talk about in terms of neurodiversity in your breakout sessions. The way we look at it is neurodiversity is about all different brain types. It's about different ways that different brains work. Some of those brains will be what's considered neurotypical, the way that people are expected to behave and act and think about things. And some of those will be neurodivergent brains. They'll be different. And we'll look in a moment about what that category is in terms of neurodivergence. The reason why this is important is because sometimes you will see a museum talking about the fact that it delivers for neurodiverse audiences or neurodiverse people. Neurodiversity is a community. It's lots of different people with lots of different brain types, some of which will be neurotypical and some of which will be neurodivergent. Neurodivergence itself is those brain types that are different. So when we talk about those two terms, we tend to use neurodiversity about a community that includes all different brain types, and neurodivergence about an individual. And it's kind of a basic grammatical terminology there, but it's also really important because it's an understanding that those terms exist and that people should be given that right to be addressed in the right grammatical way. So when we think about neurodivergence, it includes but isn't limited to some of these things here. So Some of these you may have heard of. You may already be developing and delivering programming to support. You may already be thinking about this in terms of your organisations, and some may be different or new. And some of them have very clear progresses and paths towards a diagnosis, and some don't. So this session isn't going to go into specifics about what characterises somebody who's autistic or someone who's ADHD or someone who's dyslexic. Those bits of information we can cover in other sessions. But at this stage, it's really important to understand that there are lots of different, as I think you picked up in your breakout sessions, there are lots of different neurodivergent brains and lots of different needs that as organisations we need to be considering. Sometimes as a sector we have focused specifically on one of those areas and not considered that actually there's lots of different people that we should be thinking about, and also that often there are comorbidities, so an intersectionality across these conditions. So you will often find somebody who is autistic is also dyslexic. How do you support and provide for that? And we'll talk a little bit later about how that can be supported. So I think this is a really key thing to look at, because traditionally neurodivergence has been approached in terms of a clinical deficit model, and that's the medical model of disability that you see at the top. That's where the individual has got a problem, the individual has got something wrong, there's something that's affecting that person, and that needs to change. And we talk about that in terms of they've got an issue, they struggle with something, they find something difficult, and we talk about it very much in terms of those, how the individual can change. When we do that, we forget that actually, particularly for neurodivergent people, we're in a society which is set for neurotypical people. And what we need to consider is, how do we shift what the society looks like? How do we shift what we do so that we are naturally including and making an equitable society model for neurodivergent people? And as organisations, to do that, we have to think about what are the barriers that are already in place. What tends to happen when we consider it as the individual is we add things on to what we do. So we have all our organisation activity happening, and we might develop a range of programming and exhibitions. And then after that, we think, oh, so where do neurodivergent people fit? And then we might do a quiet hour. But when we do that, we exclude further, because we aren't thinking, where are neurodivergent people when we're planning and thinking about our activity at the start? And then there may be additional things that need to be added. But by doing that, we're supporting the whole of our society, because there will be people who are neurotypical that are also anxious, who would also benefit from some of the things we put into place for neurodivergent people. It doesn't cost lots of money. It doesn't take lots of effort to do it, but it makes a massive difference and naturally includes people who would otherwise be excluded. And also when we talk about it, we tend to be then using much more positive, proactive language in terms of the way we're thinking about these individuals. Often when we talk about the medical model, we're looking at a stereotypical view of what it is to be neurodivergent. And that stereotypical view is often less able, less potential and less need within what our organisations deliver, and that absolutely isn't what we should be aiming to achieve. So that's really key in terms of that terminology. And then describing a neurodivergent individual. This is contentious, and I think it's really important that you know that it's a contentious thing within the neurodivergent community. Person first language versus identity first language. So person first language is where we talk about a person suffers from, a person is on the spectrum, or a person with autism, almost suggesting that those people are able to pick up and put down the specific neurodivergence that they recognise as. That's not how it works. If you are autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, that is part of who you are, and it is really difficult to pick that up and put that down. You just are. And as a result, it means that we talk about things in terms of identity first language. An autistic person, a dyslexic person. That's again important, because the neurodivergent community are very keen that we move towards that identity first language, because it recognises that it's valuable to understand somebody is an autistic person, and we don't need to shy away from that, and we don't need to consider that this is something that we can change. We need to recognise that there are lots of values in somebody being neurodivergent, and that that's okay. And we're not, sometimes the phrases like on the spectrum are used to almost hide away from the fact that somebody is autistic, and that's not something that we should be doing. Neurodivergent people don't have to feel ashamed about the fact that they're neurodivergent. In fact, actually it can be a massive benefit. So it's quite important to think about, if you're working with neurodivergent audiences or you're developing neurodivergent activity, how you communicate that within your marketing, or when you're developing work where you go and talk to neurodivergent audiences. It's really important to understand that there may be a real need to ensure you're using the language that that group that you're working with wants you to use. So I find this a really useful kind of little handy guide about what are all these different terms and where do they all fit. So neurodiversity being that natural difference of all different human brains, some of which are neurotypical, some of which are neurodiverse. The neurodiversity paradigm came about because, and people started using that term, Judy Singer in the 1920s started to say, we need to stop thinking about neurodivergent people as being other and different in a negative way. We need to start understanding why these brains work differently, and we need to start ensuring that we're shifting society to make it accessible. And when people talk about neurodiversity, often they will compare things like a Mac and a PC. You know, if you're asking a Mac to operate to PC standards, it isn't going to work, but there's nothing wrong with the Mac. It's just the fact that it's being asked to operate in a totally different environment. And then the neurodiversity movement is people trying to shift this and trying to make people understand why neurodivergent people absolutely have this right to be identified as very valuable and equitable within society. And then neurodivergent, a person whose brain functioning is different from what is considered the normal. I think eventually we'll probably work out that most people's brains are not typical. But at this moment in time, we're still at that stage of kind of categorizing where people fit. And that can be quite difficult. So that's a background to the terminology and where things fit. I think it's really important to understand that there are still contentious issues around that. Neurodiverse movement is still very early on in many ways. So there's still lots of discussion and lots of people who disagree with the different terminology that's used. If you talk to lots of neurodivergent people, you will tend to generally find that they are working within that neurodivergent movement. And I would always advocate that the centre of all of your activity is around that lived experience voice. What we tend to see is lots of activity for children, but not so much that's around adults. And there's also not an awful lot of consultation with neurodivergent adults. That's across our whole society. So if you talk about schools, for example, there's activity put into place that hasn't gone anywhere near a neurodivergent person, but is for neurodivergent children, which doesn't make sense, because you'd want to be talking to neurodivergent adults to find out how do you need to shift what you're doing for children. That isn't happening yet, and it isn't happening within a lot of our sector either. There are some really good examples, but across the board generally it's not something that's taking shape. So as a result, we developed the Neurodiverse Museum. We'd recognise that within the sporting heritage sector and within the museums and heritage sector more widely that we were working, people were asking quite a lot about, well, what is neurodiversity, and who are neurodivergent people, and what do we do? How do we help? And also people feeling very, I think unconfident isn't a word, but I'm going to use it anyway, feeling very unsure about saying, I don't know what to do. And that was almost preventing people from doing things in the first instance. They were too worried about getting things wrong. So we were successful in getting some funding from Art Fund. And it looked very much about exploring those gaps within museum and wider cultural sector provision, looking at how people were accessing museums, what was being put into place specifically to ensure that neurodivergent people felt that museums were somewhere they wanted to go and felt safe? What about representation? How are neurodivergent people represented within the collections and within the delivery of what museums and cultural institutions are doing? And where do neurodivergent people fit within the workforce? What we were finding was that there were lots of people who are neurodivergent who were not comfortable to say, I'm neurodivergent, because they didn't feel that the workforce was ready for them to say that. And we also found that there were lots of people who recognised that they fitted the criteria of neurodivergence, but didn't have a diagnosis or understand where that fitted for various different reasons. And there are lots of issues around why that happens. For example, lots of women are diagnosed in their 30s and 40s because their children are diagnosed and they suddenly go, oh, hang on, I recognise what's happening for me here. So there will be people within your workforces who potentially are neurodivergent, don't recognise that they're neurodivergent, but if you're putting things in place from the start, then you're naturally supporting those people. So this project was looking at that, was looking at where are we as a sector at the moment and what do we need to do to shift it? And it was very much a pilot programme. It placed neurodivergent voice at the centre of everything that we did and was aiming to ensure that that was the central point to all of the strategy going forward around the Neurodiverse Museum. So we created some baseline research that looked at what exists at the moment in terms of development for neurodivergent people. And we found that there was a lot of add-on activity, so things like quiet hours, things like sensory maps, but there wasn't a lot of integration of that activity within what museums were delivering. So there wasn't so much consideration of neurodivergent people may like our collections a lot. They may have a real interest in our collections. How do we ensure they get greater access to our curatorial staff? That wasn't happening. We found that it was very much more kind of, we need to make things sensorily accessible, but we need to do that in a confined way rather than thinking, for example, how do we ensure that neurodivergent people know when the museum's quiet so that they can choose when they turn up if they want it to be quieter? That wasn't happening. So that baseline gave us a really clear understanding that people were wanting to try and do this activity, but the way they were doing it was often excluding rather than including. Excuse me, just have a drink. And then we looked at the training needs. So why was this happening and what were people saying that they needed? And we'll look a little bit later. We created the Museums and Neurodiversity Network to find out more about what are those training needs, what were people saying they wanted. And it was things like this. So a general introduction to what is neurodiversity, what does that mean for me, what does that mean to my organisation, things around confidence, things around looking at what is good practice, what might that be, and thinking about how to work with other organisations and specifically how to consult with neurodivergent people. So all of those things are things that we're now in the process of developing a wider programme of support across the sector. And that's the next steps. So you can visit the Neurodiverse Museum. I think we're going to send these slides around, Fran, is that right?
Yeah, I will circulate everything after the session.
Thank you. So you'll get access to this and you'll be able to click on there. And Soraya runs the website now, and there are some blogs starting to develop on there that are from Neurodivergent Voice, and there's some resources on there and there's some links, and that is going to just grow as we develop the programme. And you'll also find the links on there to the Neurodiverse Museum, the museum network as well. So our aim in terms of what we're developing for neurodivergent people is to ensure that they're equitable cultural institutions. We don't use the term inclusivity because what we're finding is that term is more about including, and it almost seems to be okay that including is happening without considering what the quality of that engagement is and the relevance of that engagement. And whilst including is brilliant, it isn't the same as equitable. And we found within our research that that was almost seen as enough. We've got a quiet hour, we've got a space, there we go. And what we're trying to say is that's not acceptable, because effectively by doing that you're excluding further rather than making that an equitable experience. And it's not about, excuse me, sorry, I've got a cold at the moment, so I'm just getting through it, but it's fine. It's not about raising awareness. Most people have heard of autism. They might not have heard of some of the other neurodivergent terminology, but most people have heard of dyslexia, they've heard of ADHD. It's about acknowledging and appreciating that these audiences are relevant for us. We need to consider what we're doing as cultural institutions to make sure that our environment, our workforce, and our representation of collections is equitable. And it's about meaningful consultation and engagement. So those things that I was talking about earlier, how do we ensure that we are properly making neurodivergent voice at the centre of what we're doing in the same way that we would in terms of any other community? How is that happening? And we know from the research that people are really, really unsure of how to do that. It's coming from a stereotypical position of not being sure, all those kind of clinical deficit models, discussions of learning disabilities, those kind of things are preventing people from going, actually, why am I not doing this in the same way that I would consult with any other organisation? Why is it acceptable to get that information arm's length, maybe from a teacher or a parent, instead of actually going and talking to a dyslexic adult? That's what I should be doing. I would do that for any other community. I should be doing that now. So we're talking about that. And then there's these 3 levels of engagement. So the provision, what we do for neurodivergent audiences when they come into our sites, how do we make sure that it's equitable, that it's accessible, that there's a really broad range of support for neurodivergent people, and that we're considering all neurodivergent people and we're not just thinking about autistic people. And then representation, where are neurodivergent people within what we do, within our collections? When a neurodivergent person comes into our cultural institution, do they see themselves, or are they omitted from what we're delivering? And largely, when you talk to neurodivergent people, they say, I'm not there. I don't exist within those collections. And then the workforce, what are we doing within the workforce? And we'll talk about this a little bit later, specifically the reasons why this should be happening, around how are we ensuring that we are making our workforce accessible for neurodivergent people. Often the actual process of applying for a role is set up for neurotypical people. You have to ring somebody, you have to write an application form, and then you have to have an interview. Those things can be massive barriers to somebody who's the perfect candidate for your job. So thinking about how do we ensure that we put in a much more flexible, oh sorry, I can see it here, somebody, I don't know who it is. Are you okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, much more flexible access route into our organisations to ensure we're getting the right candidates, and we are making sure that those neurodivergent voices are part of what we do. And then when they're there, what do we do? How do we support them to make sure that it's a safe environment to be in? I feel quite a lot of pressure at the moment to talk about the fact that I'm neurodivergent, because it doesn't affect my role in our organisation. But I've heard from lots of people who say, I cannot say I'm autistic because I think it will impact on how people will see me, view me, and employ me. That's a really, really dangerous and concerning place to be as a cultural sector who's meant to be about equity, inclusivity, and ensuring that there's lots of diverse voices. So I think there's quite a few other people who are like me who feel like we're in that position where we can say, do you know what, it's okay. And that people get to see that there are lots of different types of ways of being neurodivergent. So this is when we developed the Museums and Neurodiversity Network. We asked questions about what people felt was needed and what activity they wanted us to deliver. And you're seeing some of that here within this session. There was lots of discussion and lots of asking for change and shifting and understanding, things around mentoring, lots around signposting to support and understanding how to consult with audiences, lots of research. There is an absolute dearth of understanding about where neurodivergence fits within museums at the moment. I mean, there generally is about neurodivergent people anyway, but that is absolutely replicated when you look into how we understand that in terms of the museum sector, the cultural institution sector. and things like sharing best practice and case studies, which will slowly grow on the Neurodiverse Museum website. We hadn't intended to create that website, but there was an absolute need and a request for it. So we did workforce development and training. We were surprised it wasn't as high as some of the others, but it was still high. And then online workforce development training, this kind of activity. Lots of different needs, and it demonstrated to us that this is something that the sector is calling out for and wants that support in. So there's a lot of information there, and there's a little bit of time now if there's any questions. Fran, is there anything in the chat?
Not so far, but if anybody's got anything, if you want to stop the screen share and we get together as a group, maybe.
Good plan. Does anyone have any questions? If you raise your hand, you can either raise it physically or with the little button. I'm going to take a quick drink. No? Stunned you into silence. There'll be another session in a bit for more Q&A where we can look through things. Now, is everyone okay to carry on, or do you want to have a quick comfort break? Carry on?
Fine to carry on, Justine. Fine to carry on, thanks.
Let's do that then. Let's carry on. And I'll share my screen again. Here we go. No short break. Oh, I'm sorry. Gone too far. Here we go. So this section is thinking more about our organisations and where neurodivergent people fit. So why are they difficult places for neurodivergent people? What makes that actually so difficult? And I really like this little cartoon. I think it helps really well because we are naturally set up for neurotypical people. Our sector is, the entire environment that we live in is naturally set up that way. And so when we talk about the things that were coming back from your discussions, that first breakout about different behaviours, what we're actually talking about is that they're not neurotypical behaviours. But that doesn't mean that they're different or there's anything wrong with them. It just means that they're not what's naturally expected. And we kind of need to move to a situation where society does expect those behaviours and that they're okay and accepted just the same as neurotypical behaviours are. The neurotypical population tends to speak in riddles. It tends to have hidden social norms and structures which we are all meant to just understand, but actually they're quite coded and they are quite difficult to break down in terms of neurodivergent brain functionality. And neurodivergent brains can often think much more strategically and much more logically. It's a massive generalization, but largely that is what can happen. But what is seen is that those brains have something wrong with them or are different. And what we need to ensure is that the system stops doing that and starts to think about how do we make sure that what we're doing fits everybody from the start as much as possible. There will still need to be some adaptations, there'll still need to be some adjustments, but how do we ensure that from the start? So what makes things difficult is that often we'll have this neurotypical environment. We will require neurodivergent people to assimilate. That means we'll ask them to mask, we'll ask them to change their behaviour, we'll ask them to do things that are difficult purely because we want their behaviour to be neurotypical. That's really difficult. That's saying to those people, you're not okay being neurodivergent. It's not all right that that's what you need. We need to stop doing that. We need to start recognising, what do you need? How do we provide that? So that those people feel, I don't have to mask. This behaviour is okay. I am all right the way that I am. Because otherwise what we start doing is making people's mental health issues worse because we're saying to them they're not okay. And so I'm just going to have to move this, a little picture of you, over my final box there. So what happens is if you have a neurotypical environment with that requirement to assimilate, you create anxiety and trauma, and it makes it difficult. So if your cultural institution is set up like that, sorry, I'm going to have to ask, somebody's not on mute, but I'm going to have to ask you to just make sure you're all on mute. Tell you, it doesn't take a lot for my attention to go. Okay, thank you, whoever did that, that's brilliant. So what happens is, if your cultural institution requires that to happen, you have a neurotypical environment and you are requiring those people to assimilate, they know it's going to create anxiety and trauma, and they will all stay away. So what happens is you've got this anxiety and trauma that's caused by the experience has to be less than the quality of the experience and the relevance of that experience, because if it isn't, neurodivergent people will stay away and won't be part of your workforce and won't want to be anywhere near you, because they know it's not worth it. They know that the anxiety and the trauma they're going to be put under is going to be too difficult, so they won't be there. And what we're aiming to try and do is ensure that we minimize that anxiety and trauma by ensuring that it's a safe place for neurodivergent people. We recognize the need from the start, and that therefore that quality and relevance is high. There are also some real impetus for change in terms of legality. So I'll talk about the Equality Act specifically in a moment. There are reasons why organisations shouldn't just be doing this because it's ethically the right thing to do. They should be doing this because legally they have to do it. And there's also the really clear understanding that neurodivergent voices and brains are a real asset to cultural institutions. Now, there's a lot of discussion at the moment that says neurodivergent people and disabled people generally shouldn't be having to talk in this way and saying, you know, oh, I bring these extra things because of this. But there is a real need to understand that actually those different ways that brains work do bring different things to organisations. And by excluding those, you're excluding your organisation having really, really clear, focused strategic ways going forward, because you're narrowing both the workforce and the audience. So if we look at the Equality Act, sorry, I've written that wrong there. So it applies to our sector in the same way as every other institution and organisation. And it's about having a legal duty to ensure that discrimination doesn't happen to those with protected characteristics. And that's the specific term that's used. And there are 9 protected characteristics. And the protected characteristics include disabled people. Neurodivergent people at the moment are not specifically identified. There is quite a lot of discussion about the policy and about the Act changing to include specifically neurodivergent people. But neurodivergent people do fit within the definition of disability. And what constitutes a disability in terms of the Act? A substantial, more than minor or trivial, and long-term, more than a year, physical or mental impairment. There's that term again, clinical, I hate it, but it is the way that our policy works, which impacts on an individual's ability to carry out day-to-day tasks. So when we look at that, many neurodivergent people working in a neurotypical environment are therefore defined as disabled, because when we go back to that social model of disability, even though many neurodivergent people might not identify as disabled, many do, actually that need to function in that neurotypical world creates the disability. So for example, if I go to a shop and it's quiet, I have no problem at all. If I go to a shop and it's busy and there are people asking me questions and I have to pay, and somebody wants to know something else and my child asks me something, I find it impossible. And that environment has caused a disability for me to be able to function in the same way as everybody else. It's nothing to do necessarily with me. I can, in a different type of environment, in the same shop, work really well, but it's all about what that disablement constitutes. And as a result, because many neurodivergent people are defined as disabled, they have a protected characteristic in terms of the Equality Act. That means you have to ensure you don't discriminate against them. So when we look at the Equality Act in terms of how does it define discrimination, these are the key bits, I think, in terms of cultural institutions. So it's treating a disabled person less favourably because they are disabled. And we tend to think about that in terms of things like, have we got a ramp? Have we got a lift? We don't tend to think about it in terms of, are we ensuring that our environment is accessible for neurodivergent people? But if we don't do that, and that means that neurodivergent people cannot come into our environment and we're treating them less favourably, we're also discriminating. Indirect discrimination is where you might have a blanket policy and it covers everybody and you haven't considered how that might affect disabled people. So that blanket policy could be anything. It could be around the time that people have to turn up. It could be around how you deliver your workforce policies and meetings that might not be acceptable. If you say, I'm going to deliver our weekly training sessions for all staff and everybody must have their camera on, that will naturally exclude some neurodivergent people or make them feel incredibly uncomfortable. We would never deliver our training or any of the activity that we deliver that requires people to do that, because we know that we have people who would find that incredibly difficult and we would be discriminating against them if we did. And then harassment, this is quite an interesting one to consider. So this is where the treatment of a disabled person can create an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. And we don't think as cultural institutions that we're like that. And we are definitely not trying to do that. Everything that we're trying to do is make them welcoming spaces. But sometimes if you have an individual that comes into your organisation and their behaviour you consider to be not neurotypical, not expected, not acceptable, but their behaviour is coming purely because the environment is not okay for them, then, and you maybe then identify that, or you treat them in a way that is intimidating for them, or they find degrading, then you are harassing them. So it's having to think about, how do we ensure that we aren't doing those things? And the way of doing that is through reasonable adjustments. So this is where an organisation thinks really clearly about, what do we do that might put a disabled person and a neurodivergent person at substantial disadvantage compared with other people? And what do we need to do to shift that? And the reason why it's called reasonable adjustments is because we're not talking about spending lots and lots of money. We're not talking about lots of different types of activities that are specifically for this protected characteristic. We're talking about thinking about at the start, what is it that we can do that ensures that we're including and making an equitable position for neurodivergent people that means that we aren't excluding them. And reasonable adjustments are anticipatory, so they require organisations to think ahead. So at the start, planning, what do we need to do to ensure that neurodivergent people are part of this? How do we ensure that we don't make this a difficult gallery for people to walk through? What is it that we need to do? And a lot of that will come from discussing with neurodivergent people in the same way that you would consult with anybody else to ensure that you're making whatever you deliver not discriminatory. And it can be in terms of practice, but it can be also in terms of mindset. So organisations understanding, how do we include and involve neurodivergent people? What should we be doing? And how does our organisation need to shift its mindset to ensure that we're not just thinking, this is acceptable behaviour, this isn't acceptable behaviour. Providing auxiliary aids, it might be that you've spoken with a consultative autistic or dyslexic group and they say, this is what we need. Maybe they need ear defenders. Maybe they'd like to ensure that all of your labelling is on a buff coloured label rather than white, because white and black is incredibly difficult for most dyslexic people. How do we ensure that that can work? It's only a tiny shift, but it's making a massive difference. My daughter is dyslexic and she finds white on black impossible. So when we go around museums, I'm frequently saying to her, how could we make this different? How could this be accessible for you? She can't read the labels, but her reading age is amazing. And she says things like, if I could hear it, that would work. Or if it was on a different colour with different font, that would work. Quite straightforward, simple things that could happen, but that don't frequently. And then it can be in terms of removing physical barriers as well. And under the Act, there's no justification for failing to make a reasonable adjustment and discriminate. So that means if you discriminate and then say, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter, you've done it, you need to kind of consider why you've done it and then think about shifting that. And I think that's really, really important, because it means that it's irrelevant whether you meant to do it or not. Whether you meant to cause harm and whether you meant to discriminate doesn't matter. The fact that you have, in terms of the Equality Act, is the key. So if an organisation can't demonstrate that they've anticipated this need and that they've put into place these reasonable adjustments, then they've discriminated. And I think at this stage, because it is quite difficult in terms of where does neurodivergence fit in terms of the disability protected characteristic. I think it's very clear. I think there's a lot of training, particularly in the third sector, that is talking about this at the moment, that people aren't thinking about it but need to consider it, because at some stage there will be cases brought from neurodivergent people who start to say, hang on a minute, you're thinking about where do physically disabled people fit within this, but you're not considering me. And this is absolutely crucial. Disabled individuals don't need to be grateful that they've not been discriminated against. I find this quite a lot, that there's almost a kind of, oh, isn't it brilliant what we've done? Isn't it amazing that we've done all these things? And it's like, well, actually, these things should be being done. We should be in a society where we are trying to ensure that we're equitable, and we should be the ones going, oh my God, it's awful that we haven't done it. And then putting those things into place. And I think that's really important, because it's a different mindset again, where we're not looking at it in terms of what is it that we can do for you. We're looking at it in terms of what should we be doing? What aren't we doing? Okay, so it's back to you guys again. And then there'll be a Q&A in a bit. So what does this mean in terms of what neurodivergence is, in terms of consulting with neurodivergent people and placing that at the heart of your activity, and in terms of the legality for you in your role and your workplace? We'll have 10 minutes back into those breakout rooms. You might be with different people, I'm not sure. Fran will tell me in a minute. When you go back into those rooms and just discuss, what does it mean? How are you feeling about that information? Is it new? Is it something that you already knew about? Are there things in there that are contentious? Are there things in there that are worrying or concerning? And what, in that case, do you need from this going forward in terms of training or support or help that you don't have at the moment? And then we'll capture all of that. So I suppose if we talk about specifically when you go into this meeting, what does it mean for you? And what do you need to be able to feel comfortable and confident to properly support neurodivergent people within your workplace? Does that make sense? I can see one person. So if you nod, Janice, it's you. Does it make sense, Janice?
It definitely does. Thank you, Justine. That's really clear.
Thank you. Okay, brilliant. So Fran, over to you to put people into breakout rooms. 10 minutes.
Lovely. So as before, you'll get an invite on your screen when I open up the rooms. If you click on it, it will whisk you away. We've got 3 rooms this time as opposed to our 2 that we initially started with. And as before, I'll give you a warning when we're all going to come back together. It's now about 2 minutes to 11. So as Justine said, we'll have 10 minutes and I'm going to open up the rooms now.
Hi, everybody. Is that okay? Is that everyone back, Fran?
Yeah, we've got everybody.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to share back to the sticky notes again. So again, thinking about what we were discussing. So what does this mean for you in your role, and in terms of potential training needs, if it's all right for each group, I don't know if you allocated somebody, I forgot to ask you, but for each group to come back and just what you discussed would be brilliant, and I'll try and again capture it as accurately as possible. If I do it wrong, it doesn't, what I say isn't what you think, tell me. So who would like to go first? Feel free to unmute and start speaking. I can't see everybody. Hello. Ah, Janice.
Ever the volunteer here. I have to say, Justine and Fran, also the Photographers Gallery slightly infiltrated this entire training session, so there's a lot of us here. But just to say, in answer to your question, which was about what does this mean for my role and the workplace, or for our role, we had a discussion about consultation. One of the people in our breakout group is working with neurodivergent people as volunteers, and it's so your presentation raised, I think for all of us, raised some considerations that we need to make around consultation and consulting people, consulting neurodivergent people. One person spoke about the kind of tangible changes which are easier than the intangible changes, which I thought was a really great point. We also talked a little bit about one person in our group identified as dyslexic and talked about how actually whiteboards were an issue in their schooling, and that some colors, just stated that some colors are easier to read for some people than for others. We talked about the issue around white on black, and how a few of us were had concerns around that. It's something that our organizations have used before. And we also talked a little bit about auxiliary aids, the importance of that provision of auxiliary aids, and architecture and sound in particular, when someone walks into a place, just as by way of introduction. So and what kind of consultation could be done around the sound, the acoustics, and the architecture of a space. I think, well, hopefully other people can pitch in if I've missed things or misrepresented.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh, I've changed my colour. Okay, that's brilliant. In terms of training, did you discuss anything in terms of additional things? You've kind of covered it a little bit in there already, but I'm guessing what you've said there is where you need the training.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. No, we didn't. We got so into
It's
one particular museum. But yes, training from my perspective, what I'd find useful is around creating a welcoming, certainly initially a more inclusive environment as a welcome into a space, but also thinking about environments being inclusive. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Anybody else from that group want to add anything?
Yeah, I just to add on to what Janice said, when you say training, what I mean, who do we consult for training for that? For example, so if it is just neurotypical people who are discussing and creating a training program for somebody who is neurodiverse, that may not be appropriate. So we need to actually include people who are neurodivergent, and yeah.
Oh, I totally, yeah, definitely agree with that. Everything shouldn't be about neurotypical people making a decision about, oh, how are we going to provide an inclusive environment, for example, or think about what the needs are for neurodivergent people. It just doesn't work, and that is what has happened, and it's why we have an education sector that doesn't fit many neurodivergent people. And it's why when we look at our environments as cultural institutions, often we haven't considered those things because they're not being looked at in the same way. They're not being thought about in the same way. As if we've done quite a lot of work with the Neurodiverse Museum, working with neurodivergent young people and working with them in spaces and saying what works, what doesn't work, what do you need changed, what should be happening in these spaces to make it more accessible and more equitable. What do you want? How can that happen? And they've been amazing in terms of giving that knowledge and information, and it's not difficult. But what is difficult, I think, is that often that that consultation is being used almost in the way that you would actually employ consultants in other situations. So we have seen that a lot of particularly autistic people might have been consulted with, but actually the work that they're doing might be providing sensory boxes, or might be actually creating the sensory maps. Well, in any other kind of position for cultural institutions, we'd employ consultants to do that. But we're saying, actually, because you're autistic, you should just be doing this. So we've got to tread that fine line between we're actually asking those people to deliver something that is beneficial to our organisation, and therefore should we be paying for that? Actually, we're being discriminative because we're not doing that, and we're not thinking about that either. So I think there's a real need for the sector to understand that where consultation ends and where activity that is paid or should be paid activity begins. But yeah, totally, as you can see, totally agree, and I'll just go on forever about that need for neurodivergent voice in the centre of it. Thank you. Anything else to add from that group? Okay, the next group. Just unmute yourself and start talking if you want to, if you feel comfortable to.
Well, I could. Is that group 2? Is that our group, Francesca, Nick, and Lucy?
Go for it.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'll just say something at the beginning. We tended to focus on the effects which architecture, buildings, and lighting have on the morale and of staff, and also for staff who are neurodivergent. Because when we designed the Photographers Gallery 12 years ago, we weren't really aware of the effects that the architecture might have both on our audiences and on our staff. And one of the members drew attention to the fact that a neurodiverse person would find it very difficult to work in our open plan office, which is, quite noisy, quite a lot of light in it. There's always conversations going on. And so that's a difficult space as it is. So we might need to really consider how we can make that work better in those circumstances moving forward. And also, we've always been very aware that a large proportion of our enterprises staff work in a dark basement without any daylight. And we have been aware for the last decade that has caused problems to them, and I'm sure would to neurodiverse people. So we discussed how we might come up with some solutions for that, because that's a perennial problem. And Nick from Wrexham is designing a new museum, so perhaps they have a greater opportunity at this point to address some of these problems in design for this new Wrexham museum. But he also drew attention to the fact that, ironically, of course, many museums by their nature have to be dark, and in some of the places where people are working in museums are dark because of the conservation needs of the objects. So that's sometimes, weighing up the conflict of the needs of the objects that are in your safeguarding responsibility against the needs of the staff who are working in those spaces, sometimes in the darkened spaces, is also something of a challenge. That seems to be most of what we covered, but Nick or Lucy or Francesca, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I guess we spoke a bit about application forms and how do we signal to prospective applicants that we are inclusive. We recently, or more than inclusive, equitable, we recently changed the application form to say we particularly welcome applications from people currently underrepresented in the art sector. And I think that's quite broad. It doesn't just cover, sexual orientations or race, but then where we fall short is, I think, in the specific application form that you need to fill in. You need to say, do you consider yourself as having a disability? And maybe that language is too narrow. It should be broader, because it's almost like putting the onus on them. So we spoke a bit about how do people self-identify, and do they feel that in an application form, it kind of puts them at a disadvantage to kind of say it so openly. And so we debated a bit that.
Oh gosh, that's so important. Sorry, have I written that right? Yes, I have. That is so important, because often people, we did some research again, and people were saying, I don't feel comfortable to say. And I was actually starting an application to the Arts Council for funding, and the first question was, it said things around, we're really interested for activity around neurodivergent people. So that's brilliant. So they said that. And then when you clicked into the next bit, it then asked who are the primary audience or audiences, and neurodivergent people had disappeared. So even with those organisations, they're recognising they need to start thinking about this, but then they're then forgetting, where does that fit within everything that we do, just as a natural part of it. So actually what we have to tick there is disability, but then we have to say, but a lot of neurodivergent people wouldn't identify as disabled. There needs to be that category that's saying, where are neurodivergent people within this? So that people feel, okay, it is about me as well. And the sector gradually shifts to ensure that people do feel comfortable. It's going to take a while, but at the moment, people don't feel happy. I've had quite a lot of people respond to me after these training sessions saying, I want to say, that I'm ADHD or dyslexic or autistic, but I don't feel like I can yet. I don't feel comfortable in my organisation to make that clear. And that is disabling me because I'm not able to access for the things that I need support with. We have to change the sector so that that doesn't happen. And the best way to do that is anticipate what those needs are for everybody so that that change happens. And application forms are a key part of how do we get different people within the sector. If we're making that difficult, we're preventing people from applying in the first place. Thank you. Anyone else from that group? Anything else to add? Okay, the final group. You know who you are now.
Well, I'll just say, I think what strikes us is the need for a sector-wide a sector-wide movement that allows best practices to be shared, because you know, I think there's a shared desire to make things happen, but there's also a lot that can be learnt from different kinds of institutions. So Caroline in our group works in the National Archives. You know, what the things that she might be looking at in terms of best practice in archives aren't just relevant to them. You know, it may well be relevant to the way we work, the way we structure our working practices, the way we even structure our, you know, the organisation. So I think the sector-wide focus is very important in terms of in terms of outcomes that really have an effect, rather than things being very siloed into a specific department in a specific institution that, you know, that then has a very particular focus on these issues. And I can see how that siloing happens, because there's a nervousness, as we talked about. There's a nervousness about getting things wrong.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense that, you know, it gets siloed because it's seen as a specialism. And so how do you address that? And I think that's probably something through something more wide, something more sector-based, something beyond the organisation. And we also talked about, I mean, specifically from the photographer's gallery point of view, thinking about also how people even get to the gallery, because we're just off Oxford Street. We're an absolute nightmare. Oxford Street's just busy, loud. You know, what are those wider considerations and pressures that need to be brought to bear in terms of thinking about transport? So linking us in, rather than us trying to change at the end point, you're trying to look at things more widely, bring a bit more pressure to bear on the wider experience of people, as well as just what happens within these four walls.
Thank you. That's brilliant. The sector-wide thing is music to my ears, because that is exactly what that application's for. Because we're the more of this we're doing, the more we're realizing there's a massive gap and there's a massive need to change, and the sector wants to change. But there is so much nervousness and so much unsurety about how to do that and how to go about doing it the right way. And it's really heartening that people want it to change, they want to do it the right way. But often the people that we talk to within some of the training are not in a position within an organisation to make that change. And that's what needs to happen. The sector needs to be thinking about it. And the leaders of those organisations need to be thinking about it and making it a priority. Because otherwise you do just end up with siloed activity. We'll do a quiet hour, that'll be enough. Let's move on to something else. And it's not okay to do it that way. Anyone else from that group like to add anything else? Nope. Okay, thank you so much. So I'm just going to save that and then stop sharing my screen. So I noticed that we've got 4 minutes left. So we would usually go into a second breakout space now and just talk about, for you to talk about what you would do as one proactive thing going forward. Because of time, I'm going to ask you to just think about that when we finish, so that you make sure that you take that into it. So just one thing that's proactive that you think you could do going forward to shift this, so that neurodivergent audiences and workforce are considered more within what your organisation is doing. We have 3 minutes left for any questions. Is there anything in the chat, Fran? I don't think there is, no. Stunned you into silence.
I just doing this train stay, just a quick example I heard about last year came to mind in football, where a dad had taken his son to his first ever game at Arsenal, and I think his son had autism. Basically, his dad soon realised that his son was pretty much overcome by the crowd and the noise, and he decided to take his son home. And on the way out, he was met by a steward who sort of asked, "Oh, is there anything wrong? Why are you going home?" And basically, after a sort of call on the radio, they took him to a sensory room at the grounds, and they had a sort of fantastic experience. And I remember it being him being interviewed on the radio, this dad. So yeah, it's just
I heard about that.
Yeah,
it sounded amazing. Apparently a lot of football stadiums that are doing that now, football clubs.
Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? I'll post a link on the chat if I can find one. Just thought I'd mention it.
Thanks, Nick. No, definitely. There are a lot of football stadiums. I've seen that where they have sensory rooms and spaces. And for some autistic people, that is amazing. For my autistic child, he likes that noise and all the stuff that's going on. It's almost like his favourite place in the world. So it's that kind of ensuring that those things are considered at the start, which they obviously had at that ground. They'd obviously considered, what do we do if we have somebody who needs that additional space or needs it to just be quieter? Where can they go and make sure that they feel safe? And I think if you've got all those things in place at the start, that's what makes the difference. And yeah, I think football are definitely starting to think about it. Thank you. And thanks for posting it. I think we'll share that chat as well, won't we, Fran? We'll save the chat and share it too. And Caroline, thank you. I think you shared a link as well. Thank you. We'll make sure that all gets distributed to everybody. One more minute. Any other questions or comments? No. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and participation, and hope it's been useful. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll make sure we put the recording, I think, on YouTube at some point in the next month. We'll share information as well as soon as possible, and you'll get access to those links in the chat and the PowerPoint. The next Neurodiverse Museums network is on the 1st of February, I think. If you go onto the website, you'll find a link for it. If you can't find it, give me a shout. But you're very welcome to join and see what's going on there. Thanks, everybody.